right, this is episode 2 of our Easter series. We are going to focus on the events that likely happened on the Monday following Palm Sunday and the masterful follow-up of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem as the King, with the meaning, the deep meaning behind the cleansing of the temple. Here we go. All right, so the Gospels all give different accounts of the cleansing of the temple and the things that occurred on that day. And that's what they're supposed to do, right? These are 4 different witnesses of the events of the life of Jesus and 4 different witnesses of the atonement and of his sacrifice. And so we're going to get different accounts that come through different people, different areas. And remember, these were written well after, some of them much, much, much after the events that actually took place here with Jesus. So we're going to kind of bring some of those together each of these days in this series and just give an idea of what might have happened on each one of these days. This one focuses on Monday. So recapping where we're at, Jesus has entered Jerusalem as the King of Kings, right? The king from the temple drama of the ancient Israelites. This is Jehovah, who was prophesied to come down to condescend all mankind, to be born of a virgin, and to take on the sins of the entire world. The environment that we have here is one of many different Jewish sects, where some may have had an idea of what the Messiah truly was, that is, Jehovah coming down and taking on the sins of the world. Some may have had kind of a corrupted vision of what the Messiah is, and some may have had a very, very corrupted vision of what the Messiah was. And so we need to keep that in mind when you go through the New Testament, that not all of the Jews are lockstep on their doctrine and on their theology, and even on some of their culture, right? What we're typically talking about with the Jews when they are mentioned in the New Testament is really the establishment. It's those that are in power. It's more likely you hear a lot about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. These are 2 separate sects. The Pharisees are more the party of the people, if you will. The Sadducees are a little bit more elitist. They are the ones that are in charge of the temple and the priesthood at this point. And then you have the scribes, who are Levites, and they are given, Jesus disparages them because they have likely, with control of the scripture, made numerous changes. And some by accident, some simply by translation, and some maybe by agenda that has happened, right? And so keep that in mind. We're talking about different groups of people, but there is one that is in control of things, especially in Jerusalem, and that is the Jews. So as Jesus has entered into Jerusalem, which his disciples had counseled him not to do, but as he is coming to Jerusalem at the beginning of Passover here, we talked about how the festival or Feast of Tabernacles that happens in the fall and the rituals that happen around that are actually taking place here during the week of Passover. And there's a reason for that, again, is the life of Christ would have been what was focused on even more in the Feast of Tabernacles and the Day of Atonement. These are highly ritualistic events that changed. And remember that certain things had changed within the temple in the Old Testament at different times. In the time of Isaiah, they changed. We had a change in inside of actually with the emblems even, and the theology perhaps of the temple. And then later with Josiah, a massive reform where the Deuteronomists made several changes in the theology and in the rituals of the temple. I believe what has happened in these major reforms is even though it's been written as something very positive, it's very possible and looks like to me that what has actually happened is that Christ has been removed. Or at least the idea, not that just, because when we talk about Christ, remember that is the Greek translation of Messiah. And so Messiah, the idea of a Messiah still exists, but the idea that Jehovah would come down and take on the sins of the world was pretty much pushed to the side at these times. That's what ends up completely falling apart for the Jews when they were dealing with Babylon and Egypt, when Jerusalem was destroyed in the time of Lehi. And so here is Jesus coming in, trying to restore all of this that has been lost. The temple drama during the Feast of Tabernacles, the enthronement of the Davidic king that would have happened in that drama, that would happen typically every year, and especially when there was a new king that was brought in, and the procession that would have happened and bringing that new king in, and the renewing of the covenant that happens, the covenant of peace, where the high priest and the king would have been going through specific dramas and enactments and rituals that had been removed. And Jesus is trying to bring a lot of this back. So we're going to talk a lot about the rituals that happened during the Feast of Tabernacles and the Day of Atonement. That's Yom Kippur. Because they're very important, and those themes run throughout all of the week of Passover. So we'll be touching on those most every day this week. So here, the authors of the gospel want to follow this up, showing that Jesus is the king, and now they want to show his priesthood authority as well. Here we have the royal, secular authority of him being the king, and now they want to show him as the authority that he has as the high priest. And so that's what starts to happen in this day here on Monday. So we're going to go to Mark and see what happens. He leaves Bethany, right? He had gone back to Bethany, at least according to Mark. Then on Monday morning, he comes in, and it says that he was hungry. And seeing a fig tree, this is Mark 11:13, and seeing a fig tree afar off, having leaves, he came, if haply he might find anything thereon. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for the time of figs was not yet. And Jesus answered and said unto it, No man eat fruit of thee hereafter forever. And his disciples heard it. Now, Mark actually has them seeing the fig tree wither away the next day. Matthew doesn't. So I'm going to include that here on the day of Monday, according to Matthew. And what happens is he curses the fig tree, and then presently, it says in Matthew, presently the fig tree withers away. And so they see the fig tree, that it has, the roots have withered away. And Peter, calling remembrance, saith unto him, Master, behold, the fig tree which thou cursest is withered away. And Jesus answering saith unto them, Have faith in God. For verily I say unto you, this is verse 23, that whosoever shall say unto this mountain, Be thou removed, and be thou cast into the sea, and shall not doubt in his heart, but shall believe that those things which he saith shall come to pass, he shall have whatsoever he saith. There's two things that are important here. Number one, he's talking about the priesthood, right? He's talking about the authority of the Melchizedek priesthood. Whenever you see the idea of mountains being brought down and made into valleys, whenever you see the moving of a mountain, that's got several references to being able to move mountains in the scriptures. That is, as far as I can tell, that is a reference to the Melchizedek priesthood. Not just the Aaronic priesthood, but the Melchizedek priesthood. So this is something where, again, throughout the New Testament, they're showing him restoring the Melchizedek priesthood. But on this day specifically, the references that they are talking about are about his authority over the Melchizedek priesthood. And then they come into Jerusalem. And we've all heard this about the cleansing of the temple. there's a much deeper meaning to what is happening here. This is not just a matter of degrading a consecrated space. This is much more. This is about Jesus's authority as the high priest of the Melchizedek priesthood. So he comes in, and remember that the temple, this is the second temple. This is the temple of Herod. And when the Jews came back from Babylon in the 6th century BC and had the permission of Cyrus from Persia, the king of Persia, to return to Jerusalem and build the temple, they imposed something that they did not impose with the first temple. And that is a tax, a temple tax that everyone had to pay when they came in to go to the temple. This is very interesting because when the Jews built the temple, when they came back from Babylon, they did not allow any other groups of people to contribute. There were other groups that wanted to contribute to having the temple at Jerusalem rebuilt. The Jews, remember, the primary sect, the Jewish sect, was in control of this. And they did not allow anybody else to contribute. Now, this may have been the Samaritans that would have been around. This would have been perhaps other Jewish sects that were in the area that maybe never went to Babylon. They could have been left behind. We're told in Jeremiah that a number of the poor were left behind, and there were other groups that were left behind. Even Jeremiah was left behind with a group for a while. There are others that had gone to Arabia, what they called Arabia at the time. We know Lehi left at this time. There was a big scattering that happened here. A lot of people went to Egypt, and some stayed and actually built temples in Egypt, Jewish temples in Egypt. And others may have come back up from Egypt and repopulated the land that may have held on to older traditions. But those that came back in charge said, no, this is ours, and we're going to charge a tax to everybody that comes in. So this goes directly to what is happening with Jesus here. Again, it looks to me like he is, again, kind of slapping the face of those in charge of the establishment that's here. And he's saying, no, your man-made economy here, where people come in to pay a temple tax, let's think of that as payment. Again, payment. These are merchants. What does that mean? It is a man-made economy where they are making, in a sense, atonement to come into the temple. Now, what I think is happening here is there's a contrast between this man-made economy of atonement and what Jesus is offering with spiritual atonement. What represents that? It's the rituals that happened on the Day of Atonement anciently in the first temple. We'll go over that in a lot more specifics later on, but one of the things that happened on the Day of Atonement was that the high priest, who would change his vestiture often, would make a sacrifice of an ox, would make a sacrifice of a goat, and he would take the blood from these animal sacrifices and he would cleanse the altar, right? And he would go around and he would cleanse other parts of the temple. And he would go, and how would he do that? He would do that by sprinkling the blood of the animal sacrifices. And he would sprinkle the blood actually going into the Holy of Holies and sprinkle the Ark of the Covenant. And it was doing this to act as the blood, which really represents the blood of Christ, that was purifying the temple. It would purify the high priest and his own family. And then it would purify the people as well and the land. And so that was the Day of Atonement. And you can imagine a high priest. You can think of what happens sometimes in Catholic Mass. I'm not sure exactly what the terminology is on this, but think of, right, of using the instrument that would move like this. And that's what the high priest would be doing when he is sprinkling the blood onto these different areas. And what does Jesus do? He comes in and he says, Okay, I see here the man-made economy, how you have twisted the temple into this lower law, man-made economy and atonement. And I'm going to raise this back up and show what my real authority is. And so he throws over the tables. He kicks out all of the money changers that are collecting these taxes and offering up selling the sacrificial animals that people would use in the temple. And what does he use? He uses a whip. He uses a whip. Why a whip? What is he doing here? Think about it. Is it because he's trying to be violent with everyone? And a lot of people say, well, this is the only example we see of Jesus really getting mad. No, it is the authors and the symbolism of what Jesus did here with the Day of Atonement, with Yom Kippur. And he goes out and he is using a whip and basically sprinkling and cleansing out the temple, just like the high priest did on the Day of Atonement during the Feast of Tabernacles. And so he is showing that he is the high priest. Not just any high priest, but the high priest and the authority of the Melchizedek priesthood. And that he is removing and cleansing out the dirt and corruption of this man-made economy and how the temple is being used here, and purifying it and bringing in the higher level law of spiritual atonement and bringing in the spiritual economy into the temple. And then back in Matthew chapter 21, after he has done all of this and cleansed the temple, it says here in verse 14, and the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. So you can see how the authors are putting this together, right? Where they're showing him as the high priest and how he is cleansing the temple and healing the people and healing the land. That's what the high priest was supposed to do on the Day of Atonement. The 4 filters or lenses that we talk about on this podcast, they all apply in hyper mode during the week of Easter. All right, the higher and the lower law. Here we have again looking at this, the man-made economy and a man-made atonement, and the spiritual economy and a spiritual atonement that he is going to offer. We have temple imagery, which we saw in the last episode on Palm Sunday, and it's what happens here. This is ritual that is happening. And the authors want to show it this way, want to make sure that you understand that this is about ritual and about the festival and the Feast of Tabernacles and the Day of Atonement. Jesus is the high priest. So temple imagery and drama, which we've gone over a lot. Third is the authorship. This is what the authors are trying to get across. They are trying to show a replacement, a reaching for a higher law by saying that Passover had been lowered by the Jews at the time, and that the Day of Atonement and the Feast of Tabernacles is where the center of the doctrine of Christ is. And so they're bringing in all of this symbolism from the Feast of Tabernacles and the Day of Atonement. And then lastly is the Nehor principle, right, which is the corruption of the idea of the true Messiah, of Jehovah coming down and taking on the sins of the world and being the Savior. Everything falls apart without that. That has to be at the top of the values hierarchy. And so that is what is being shown here. And of course, what is going to be acted out eventually here in a few days is going to be the great event that everything hangs on with the doctrine of Christ. And so the chief priests and the scribes and the elders come to Jesus and say, again, the discussion of authority here. By what authority are you doing this? And with a brilliant response, a rhetorical response, really, but he responds with another question to the chief priests, to the scribes, and to the elders. And he asks them, by what authority did John the Baptist preach? In other words, did he preach with the authority from heaven, or did he teach and preach with the authority of man? And so the people in charge here know that everyone around them, especially those that are there with Jesus, believe that John the Baptist is a prophet and that he was definitely inspired and that he was given this authority by God. It came from heaven. And of course, Jesus knows that everybody there knows that John the Baptist preached about Jesus being the Christ, about him being Jehovah. He is the Messiah. So what are they going to say? And so they're afraid to answer this. And so Jesus says, look, if you're not going to answer that, if you can't do that, then I'm not going to answer where my authority comes from. But it's the question of authority that is posed here by Jesus and by the authors of the Gospels on the day 2, the authority of the priesthood. And then Jesus follows this up with a couple of parables. In the last one, it is the parable of the wicked husbandman. And basically, the gist of it is that the Lord of the household and the vineyard goes off and leaves and hires a husbandman to take care of, it would be the animals in the land and the vineyard, etc. And then when it's time for harvest, he sends the servants out to the homestead, basically, and the husbandman kills the servants or stones them or chases them off. And then finally, the owner says, well, I'll send my own son. Certainly they're going to respect him. And he sends his son. But the husbandmen say among themselves, well, this is the son and the heir. We're going to kill him and we're going to be able to keep this place for ourselves. And obviously this is about the chief priests, about the elders and the scribes and everybody else, the Sadducees and Pharisees that Jesus has been dealing with this entire time. Why? Because God had given them the authority to run the kingdom of heaven on earth. And they have taken it for themselves. And basically they have changed the doctrine. They have gotten rid of the true doctrine of Christ. And they've taken control of everything, including the people. And so when prophets are sent to them, they stone them and they kill them and they run them off. And then finally, the Son is sent to them, being Jesus Christ. And what are they going to do? They're going to kill him because they don't want to lose power. You can sense just a tinge in here of understanding that, and they say that they perceive that they're talking about the chief priests. They believe that they're talking about themselves and the scribes and etc. But you can sense this tinge of truth that they perceive. They know what he is saying. And you have to imagine that at some point, in some way, they know it's true. And yet they're going to what again? They're going to double down. And they are going to go after him regardless and try and kill him. And eventually they do. And that is essentially what happens here on Monday. It is a follow-up to the king coming in to Jerusalem and showing that he is also the great high priest. Who? The new Melchizedek. Melchizedek means the king of righteousness. And so he is both the king and he is the high priest that has been foretold of, the great Messiah. And this idea that he is this person with this authority, that he is the king, that he is Jehovah, is a great threat to the establishment and those who have taken power at this time. I'll talk to you next time.